Washington.
There is a social contract that wants you to find commonality in experience. But the point is, to really do good, you need to be able to dig past several layers of that to understand that the starting point for what you're hearing from somebody else is not the same as your experience.
Support for this podcast is provided by Chamber of Progress. Chamber of Progress is a new center-left tech industry organization promoting technology's progressive future. It's working to make sure that all people benefit from high-tech advances and that tech companies use their power responsibly. To learn more about the Chamber of Progress, visit them at progresschamber.org.
Welcome to Tech Policy.
From Washington, D.C., this is Tech Policy
with Joe Miller.
Joe Miller, founder and CEO of Washington Tech.
You know, I left you alone for a couple weeks, and look at this mess. Glad to see you hanging in there. Congresswoman Elise Stefanik, the Congresswoman from New York's North Country area, 21st Congressional District up there in the Adirondacks, went on Twitter and told everybody that New York Governor Kathy Hochul's mask mandate was unconstitutional and illegal, even though the mandate had been reinstated. Here's what happened. A judge from the New York State Supreme Court in Nassau County out on Long Island held that requiring masks in New York schools was unconstitutional. However, it was unconstitutional because the governor's emergency powers had expired, not because requiring masks in school was unconstitutional in and of itself. So the mandate went back into effect. But Congresswoman Stefanik decided that either, I don't know if she didn't read the case or didn't understand the case, but I mean, she went on Twitter and told her followers that wearing masks is inherently unconstitutional, which was false. And misinformation has been in the news so much lately. You think people, especially our leaders, would be more careful about the information they put out, but unfortunately, it doesn't look like that's the case. I don't know. It's negligence at this point, which is why a lot of legal scholars have been talking about treating misinformation like a tort. In any case, that's the law in New York. No court there has held that requiring masks in schools is unconstitutional. So let's just be clear on that. These issues with parents and schools, these are absolutely insane. We're trying to create a positive learning environment and people just can't seem to get along, but there's hope. Mike Allen noted in his political email earlier this week that most Americans are generous, good, non-contentious people. We'll see. It's been pretty crazy out there. However, the great Anita Balaraman is here with me today with what an inspiring woman. This is the first time I've had a guest on the show who's read a poem. And I think we need to start doing more of that. It's such a relief to know and be reminded of the fact that the struggles we face are real, but that we're not alone. Our journeys are different, but the challenges we face in one way or another are really very much the same. Except when we start looking at the structural issues that were designed to make it look like we're all so different. And that's what we have to constantly filter out, all that noise. But Anita is a social entrepreneur, a professor at UC Berkeley, and scientist who cares deeply about women in STEM, and especially cybersecurity. It was such an honor to chat with her, and I'm delighted to share her insights with you. Anita, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks, Joe.
So I want to start with the poem you wrote on Medium. Would you feel comfortable reading that for us?
It's called Doubt. An obedient child, never wild, begged to be schooled, never want to do what she wants to. Somewhere in my teens I grew. To my parents, a quarrelsome, defiant point of view. Girls can't be safe outside of parents' purview. Unless she has a husband, never mind, she's just 22. In Berkeley, I was told you can be what you want to. Even a brown girl with big starry eyes can dream one day. To be a researcher, a professional, or even a professor someday. Worked hard, very hard, at least I thought, for I've been given a chance, a really long shot. But told that I may never be a researcher sought. There must be more than just the grades, I thought. Despite how hard I fought, hiding my feminine brownness was like adding a knot. Perhaps they are right, went my train of thought. Not see someone like me in doctoral gown. Oh, don't be sad, said my loved ones around. You can be happy, rich, and successful without a doctoral gown, hands down. Look at the valley of silicon and sand, a dreamland of success, prestige, and wealth. For those that are committed to technology at hand, yes, but my mind wandered. Where did I lose the defiance in my view? I really care about children and leukemia, and I can build risk models that I learned in academia. But can you blame them if they did not trust the models I built that needed their process to adjust? I don't look like them, speak like them. The assumptions in my models are hard to trust. I found my kind, the brown variety, who spoke bad English with no anxiety. The friends at home and those at work looked and spoke like they belonged to the same network. No apologies for being a vegetarian during the team lunch, who clairvoyantly knew that salad wasn't a good munch. This must be beautiful, to feel like you belong without having to rehearse your lines so I don't say something wrong. To work with a bunch where I hoped I belonged, I got another graduate degree, not a PhD I longed. A business degree hoping to correct the wronged. A mom twice over, a wife and an employee. You can't get promoted if you leave at 5, would annoy me. Benevolent prejudice, paternalism and sexism. Belonging, I understood with deep skepticism. A misfit, perhaps, have always been. A toxicologist, but not the wet lab kind. A technologist, but not an engineer's mind. An entrepreneur who venture capital declined. An educator living the adjunct grind. A researcher without the terminal degree, unrefined. Seeking belonging, but always unaligned. Perhaps down in my subconscious mind, the fringes appeal more than the straitjacket kind. The fringes feed concern for mistakes, suspended between two or more contradictory states, an indecision between belief and non-belief. Hiding somewhere is a fictitious fig leaf. Belonging requires suspending the lunatic fringe to honor and reflect the collective doubt. But that is harder to live day in and day out. Easier it seems to simply not honor their doubts.
Wow. So you're so open about the obstacles you've encountered on your career path. And I love that. And this podcast is about public policy primarily, but it's also about creativity, because that's ultimately what the policies that I advocate for are intended to preserve. And I think for many professionals, regardless of what field they're in, living this creative life and balancing it with work, creativity kind of takes a back seat. How have you experienced that?
I've not sought out to be creative, I'll be honest. I guess creativity, the way I interpret as I'm approaching 50, or it seems close by, is very different from how I would have defined creativity earlier in my 20s. I feel creativity is learning to move forward given the constraints you have. And these are not constraints that you pick and choose. These are unique to you. And in my experience, I experienced the constraints that I had. They may not be the same as what somebody else has. And so creativity is being like the river, at least that's how I visualize it, being able to flow around the roadblocks that are so unique to your path, but still figuring out a way around them.
You wrote a post in Tech Policy Press about how job descriptions that are overly technical can discourage applicants from applying. What are you hearing in response to that assessment? And what skills do job descriptions tend to underemphasize, in your opinion? Or do you think those are creative skills? Are they soft skills? What's missing from job descriptions that kind of turns people away from applying?
Yeah. What I've been hearing after this research is, of course, those forums which are interested in cybersecurity, specifically women, organizations that deal with underrepresented individuals, and STEM broadly, and cybersecurity specifically are the ones that seem to have reached out to me. One of the things that this started with a symposium we had for women in tech in UC Berkeley 2 years ago, where there was that's when I started trying to understand what the cybersecurity space looked like. And they had a career fair, and you would have a lot of job descriptions aimed at cybersecurity. And this was all targeted women in tech. And I had an intern at that point in time. And this was where, you start connecting the dots to do research a little further. You start seeing that the intern that I had was a data science intern and a double major in environmental science. Brilliant intern. And this was a time when, they had a symposium, and she would see all these job descriptions and say, I don't think I'm going to be applying for any of these. It doesn't actually. And she was a first generation student here. And I was like, really, why not? And she says, well, they clearly ask for engineering degrees. I don't have that. And I said, but you have a data science degree. Doesn't that count? And she went on to describe how the job description seems to indicate that they are specifically looking for specific majors, which is none of what she has. And how she was diffident about signing up or even applying for some of these roles. And after the cybersecurity conference, and she was my intern, and she's familiar with competencies through the summer, she had a way at least to translate, and this was what was happening, translate what the job description is asking for. And how do you translate that? How do you translate competencies? So to answer your question, is it soft skills or hard skills? Typically, hard skills are codifiable. It makes your search process easier. So it's easy to put them there. But there are skills which you kind of look at as competency. So skills are embedded in a competency. So things such as whether she got a data science degree or an electrical engineering degree, there were competencies that she had acquired, competencies that she had acquired even with an environmental science degree, and how she might think of statistical and numerical analysis, if you will, which was relevant. And this took a little bit of explaining and having her see, because she was looking at job descriptions and opting herself out. And so in response to that, that triggered my interest in this research. And I looked at what kind of articles had been published in the scientific literature around this. While there were enough articles that talked about how job descriptions don't work well, especially for women and underrepresented minorities, there was no study that actually looked to see how much do these job descriptions actually impact the talent pipeline. This is right in the beginning. If you don't even opt in, forget whether you get the job or not. You've not even applied for it, so you're out. And so I was curious to know how many people like Rachel, that was her name, my intern, should have applied, but decided not to. And so we applied for a small grant within UC Berkeley, the Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity Research. And that was the result of the research.
Tech Policy Podcast, the inclusive voice of tech policy.
I listened to your podcast interview on gritty serendipity, and your career, I was going to say, sounds a lot like mine. Challenge of trying to build a business and navigate a career at the same time. It's definitely not for the faint of heart, and I think a lot of people are leaving their jobs now. I know a lot of people are leaving the mass resignations are leaving their jobs, and I'm not sure they know what they're in for. So I hope they're doing a lot of planning before they make that decision. But your workaround has been to create multiple sources of income. And you talk about how important that is. And you talk about having working three jobs. How does staying busy affect your motivation?
That's a hard question. It is hard, as you can tell. Sounds like you're kind of juggling the same three balls. But there is, in some ways, I find us fortunate that the three jobs that I have are not mutually exclusive. I think that helps. So my work as an adjunct faculty helps me work with the students. So I see firsthand the issues they have. That has led into the research areas where I'm still digging further to see what kind of an impact a possible technology could make. And my prior work, before I started the adjunct grind, like I mentioned, was actually in technology and product management. And so if I were to apply not technology for technology's sake, but technology for a social reason that exists, like technology for social good, then it's critical that I stay engaged with the student population and be able to build a technology that meets that need that I'm passionate about, or I feel a big pull towards that. Let's just put it that way, and do the research that actually helps support both of those. So in some ways, they're not mutually exclusive, and I would say that that helps balance, if that makes sense.
And you also talked about networking, and something I struggle with is, going to these networking events. Thank God they don't have as I shouldn't say that, but it was tough. So, you talk about networking and not being familiar with it. How do you process it when you're the only one in the room? And what are some of the things you tell yourself to keep your mind at ease when you're feeling totally isolated in those situations, or like a fish out of water?
So I remember Jane Goodall. I don't know if you know who she is. Jane Goodall.
Sure.
So I have a quote by her that I keep telling myself. And I have had several situations where sometimes I question, Anita, why did you even sign up for this mentoring event or this networking event? Why? You're not going to get anything from this. And sometimes experiences only help kind of make that notion concrete in your heads. But in some ways, I have to believe that. So Jane Goodall, for those that don't know, she actually was a journalist. She did not have a college degree, but it was her intense interest in chimpanzees and wildlife that made her an expert in that. And one of her quotes was saying, "You have as much of a right to be there as anybody else." And I had to remind myself of that, because it's like, I have as much of a right to be here as anybody else. I know I don't feel like I fit in, but the fact that I got there, not by hoodwinking anybody, but whatever the application process was, whatever the process was, I went through the process and I got there. And so I have to believe that, I keep reciting that Jane Goodall's words in my head just to tell myself to calm down, I would say.
Let me ask you this about men, because you talk about men and men's role in doing the best they can to notice where they may have some blind spots when it comes to equity in the workplace for women. How can men do a better job for women? And what are the good guys doing wrong? What do they need to do better?
The attribute good should be ascribed only after those that you want to help have been helped, and the people that you're trying to help kind of ascertain that. So what I mean by that is, usually the experiences may be on the surface level similar, whether you're a guy or a woman. And you tend to say, so for example, when I talk to some of my male friends and I would tell them that, sometimes people repeat what I say, or the standard cliche things, and it kind of annoys me, or sometimes I feel invisible. And there are companies where I felt that. And they would say, "Oh, I know exactly what you mean. I feel the exact same way." And I would think, "You do?" And they would say, "Yeah, I feel the same way." And they would try to, there is a social contract that wants you to find commonality in experience. But the point is, to really do good, you need to be able to dig past several layers of that to understand that the starting point for what you're hearing from somebody else is not the same as your experience. What are the structural elements? What are your mental models that actually make that experience that I'm having maybe different from yours? And if you don't get down to that level, you're never going to truly be able to be good in that sense, even though that's your intent.
So you have to get beaten up a little bit, I guess, before you can purport to have anything genuine to contribute or anything useful. It takes more of a sacrifice than I think a lot of guys think it's going to take.
If everything were working that well, I would say, in STEM, the large numbers that women are leaving would not happen this many years after. And that's an area that I'm really, it's affected me personally. So I'd say the sense of belonging, and I've had enough guys, so to speak, truly want to do that. But the point is, if you don't understand the underlying reason why, and what are some of the structural models? So they would say things like, "Oh, I really know this person. He's a great guy. And I've had a meeting with them." I would walk out with a completely different opinion about our conversation. And having some of the failures that I have had, it makes you actually understand the difference between conversations, what may be certain mental models that people operate. And I'm not blaming them. I probably operate under a lot of biases and mental models myself. But you can't get to the root of it and truly help if you're not willing to dig deeper into some of the constraints, the true constraints or lived experiences that actually shape how you perceive things, I guess is what I'd say.
What are some books you've read or are currently reading that you think folks working in equity and cybersecurity and STEM should be looking at?
In equity, and there are quite a few books that I've read in equity and kind of reframing how we think of it. But I would say when you think of a field like cybersecurity, there is a historical context to how some of these fields are rapidly changing. And the book Sapiens kind of gave me a great historical perspective and a mental model to think about how the evolution of jobs in general, how the STEM jobs are changing, if you will, and how that actually affects the current generation of students who realize that the paradigm of a one-time education leading to a lifelong employment is no longer available, but they don't have the benefit of their existing social capital to inform that, where they should be going. And I think that book has been powerful in helping me understand some of the historical context of what you're seeing and how that paradigm of education leading to employment has changed and how we see the future of AI play in. So I would say that book has definitely been one of the ones that's been influential.
And you're referring to Yuval Harari's work.
Yep, exactly.
Sapiens. So what are some final ideas you'd like to leave with us before we close, and where can we find you online?
I have to say I'm not great at leaving a strong digital footprint. I am on LinkedIn. I'm on Facebook, albeit not very active. I'm not on Twitter. I have my email address. I work at the university, and part of the reason is I've tried to be heads down, trying to build something that I think may be valuable. So you can find me on LinkedIn if you look for Anita Balaraman. And the final ideas that I'd like to leave us before we close is, as we approach the future of work in some ways, how we think about STEM, how we think about cybersecurity being one of the STEM areas, how we think about equity, how we think about the purpose for the technology that's being built is becoming more and more critical. And having technology be for technology's sake, in some senses, is a moot point, especially when you have the demand for these roles outstripping the supply. And we need to be smarter, better at attracting the talent to opt into these fields and keep them there and enable them to do the work that they do. And we don't have the luxury of writing job descriptions or enabling fostering an environment which in some ways is a weed out rather than opt-in kind of a framework.
Ms. Anita Balaraman, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. Thanks, Joe.
Washington.